Alright, so Coolidge was known as Silent Cal, and the reason was that he rarely gave any speeches at a time when other politicians around the world were beginning to use radio as a medium. Coolidge gave no speeches on the radio, or at least if he did, they were very short. There's a joke that may or may not have been true that you see there listed beneath his picture, that supposedly a woman came up to him and said, "I've made a bet against a fellow who said it was impossible to get you to say more than 2 words," and he said, "You lose." But he was the type of president that was perfect for the time. First, he helped to clean up the problems that the Republicans had with corruption, and he balanced the budget, reduced the national debt, believed the country's ills will be solved by the business system and not by progressive government, and he vetoed farm assistance bills, especially one called the McNary-Hagen Farm Bill. But this is very typical of the Republicans during this period of time. The election of 1924, Coolidge actually runs on his own to try and get the position of president through his own election, and he defeats both the Democrat candidate and a progressive candidate, the Democrat being John W. Davis. And you can see Wisconsin, as we talked about, the laboratory of democracy, actually voting for La Follette, who was from Wisconsin and was the progressive candidate at the time. You can also see here the Solid South remaining the Solid South. So we keep talking about the great prosperity of the 1920s. What actually created this prosperity? During the 20s, unemployment drops below 3%, and the average income of the average American increases by 1/3. So what are the things that caused the prosperity of the time? Well, part of it was the attitude that Americans seemed to have, with their income seeming to increase like clockwork, and a weariness of the crusading of progressivism at home and abroad. American consumers not only spent all they had, but actually got loans from banks to purchase more. Low interest credit is readily available because banks believe that since people continually get paid more and more, that they will pay the money back. And so one of the things that happens is that the notion of saving money falls to the sense of an immediate consumption. And this is something that was very different. You have to realize that for the American people to have the attitude to pick up or to buy all of these products, and actually even go into debt in order to buy them, was something that was the opposite of the fear that they had had in the past of debtor's prison. And in fact, going into debt was something that some people believed was not just immoral, but actually against the teachings of many of the Christian churches at the time. So what was it that they were buying? Well, what were called consumer durables. Now we know what a durable consumer is, that's us. But a consumer durable is a purchase or a product that was built and continues to be built today that many people will buy. And you might think of it as all the products that we now think we have to have and we can't live without. All of these become available during this period of time with the new assembly line. Now, we talked before about the old assembly line during the Gilded Age, where the workers moved back and forth. Well, now we're going to move into the 1920s assembly line, which was one in which the product itself moved along a conveyor, and the person who was working there would put on the same piece or the same part of the product each time as the product moved by. And this saving in time and in manpower from the way that it had been done in the past actually helped to drop the price of many of these products, exemplified by Henry Ford's assembly line. And what we'll see is, with electrification and these mass production techniques, many of today's necessities are available to the public for the first time and at a reasonable price, because the assembly line, even when Ford paid his workers more than a lot of other people did, still made these products much more within the range of people's income. And of course, all the people that were employed to make these products then went out and bought more. So if you want the bottom line of what causes the 1920s economy to grow, American consumers buy American products. And in fact, American consumers drive, for the most part, the American economy, as trade will actually slow during the 20s as the Americans become more of an isolationist nation in order, or as a result of their negative view of World War I and a lot of the internationalism that was part of it. But bottom line, Americans are buying American products, and it's actually driving our economy. So what types of products are we talking about? Radios, vacuums, refrigerators, cars, telephones, lamps, record players, ovens, sewing machines, and many more. You see the list here of some of the other products. Ford's automobile, which prior to the assembly line in automobile production, cars were really similar to today's helicopters. You could buy one, but they were so expensive that only the very wealthy had them, and there weren't that many around. But what Ford did, and other companies that followed suit when it came to the production of automobiles, was drive the price down to the point where the average person could actually afford it. Not to coin a pun or anything, but it was interesting because they just produced basically the same car over and over again. The most famous, of course, is the Model T, which Ford had said you can get any color you want as long as it's black. But they also made the early pickups available, and what this did was it really brought transportation and mobilization to an entire realm or part of American society that had never really had that opportunity before. You can see the great list of products that also come out during this time, many of which are still around today. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the way that the American people found out what they needed to buy was the beginning of modern advertising, which began on Madison Avenue in New York City. And it was actually sparked by early work by a psychologist by the name of John Watson, who brought the laboratory research that he and other psychologists had done as to how you can manipulate people's choices through conditioning, and they took them to mainstream America and created what we call today the advertising industry. And so you can see that much of it is the idea of bringing up an image with the product rather than just selling the product itself. So business seems to be very, very good, and as a consequence, labor unions look even more negative than they had before. And in fact, labor unions actually lose support amongst workers because there's no need for them when the average income of the average American goes up 1/3 during a decade. And unions become increasingly unpopular. And because things seem to be going so well and they seem to be so connected to business values begin to mingle with religious values. In this sense, the factories are the temples, the workers are the worshipers. And they were literally actually anti-union drives. The Supreme Court, now dominated by Republicans as Republican presidents continue to be elected, will begin to disable some of the antitrust acts, the idea being that business is good, leave it alone, or as Harding and Coolidge both will say, the business of America is business. Now, there are actually, unfortunately, a couple of industries that are depressed, but the vast majority are doing very, very well. There's actually a farming depression. Again, it's because of overproduction, as we had seen back as early as the Panic of 1819. The depression in the farm industry actually leads to a migration of African Americans from the south to the north, and we'll see this really as a consequence of both world wars. And we also see, as you see listed down there, that there were attempts by farm senators to try and get legislation passed to get the government to help farmers to deal with the problems that they were having. But the Republicans, including Coolidge, argued that farmers didn't really need any help because business worked the way that it did because that's the way things were supposed to go. So if as an individual businessman you weren't successful, then as a farmer, unsuccessful farmer, you had to move on to something else. Now, I point this legislation out because the idea was the government would step in and keep the farmers in business, but at the time it wasn't popular enough to pass. However, in the New Deal, as we'll see once the Depression hits, this will be changed and will actually create quite a bit of farm legislation. Now, if the 20s was characterized by anything at all, it was a culture war between old and new America. And this is something that's very prominent in the book that I mentioned earlier, that's sort of the Bible of this period. And William Leuchtenberg brings up the idea that there really seemed to be a war over exactly how America would develop during this time. And there was old America, which was small town America, rural America. It tended to be simplistic in its lifestyle. In religion, it tended to be very fundamentalist, the idea of going back to the basics of religion, and thus it was generally conservative, not thinking that a lot of change was necessary. Now, one of the things that they were very much against was what they called social sin, which were a lot of the activities of the other group that we'll call New America. And in general, these people tended to be Protestant. On the other hand, you also had a group of people that have been called New America. They tended to be in urban areas, more modernist in their thinking, very free thinking in religion compared to fundamentalism, culturally liberal, and as Leuchtenberg called them, fun-loving hedonists. A hedonist is somebody who is devoted to immediate pleasure, and they tended to be more Catholic than Protestant. Now, I'm not referring to the idea that the Pope was a fun-loving hedonist, but instead what I'm saying is that in general you saw more people who were in New America tended to be Catholic, and the urban areas were full of people who were not necessarily the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority that had run things in the past. Now, one of the things that was a big part of the culture war was a generation gap between the younger generation and the newer one. Now, I know this sounds a little bit like the 1960s, but in truth, the 20s and the 60s have a great amount of things that are in common. There was a generation gap that existed almost like a geological fault between younger and older America. Women no longer patterned themselves after the lives of their mothers, making the argument that there's no way their mothers could understand the new technologies, the new products, and the new lifestyle that was available to them. They would go out on dates in automobiles, which of course their mothers could never have known, and in fact the automobile itself was actually something that revolutionized not just society, but parts of it like dating and other things. And youth becomes the desirable age during this time. This is where we move from the idea of people saying I'd like to be old and wise to the idea that being young is actually the best part of life. So, the major issues that seem to split New Old America. First, wet versus dry, or how to deal with Prohibition. New America was definitely against Prohibition and actually flaunted the law itself. Old America had been supportive of it to begin with. There were all kinds of examples of what happened here, and again, there's a correlation to the 1960s. In the 60s, or in the 20s, alcohol was the drug of choice of the newer or younger generation, and in the 60s, of course, it's different types of drugs. It was also true that the younger generation in the 20s had its own music that seemed to illustrate its protest against the older generation, and of course it was jazz music in the 1920s and rock and roll in the 1960s. So one of the things that New America did to sort of flaunt the law was to have things like speakeasies, which were locations where many people would meet, and it would basically be a bar during Prohibition, but of course this was illegal, so if you knew of the location of it, you had to speak quietly about the location or speak easily about it. If you went there, knock on a door somewhere in a city, a little opening would be opened in a door and people would see who you were and decide whether or not to let you in, but if you came in, there was a full bar, probably dancing and all kinds of partying that was going on. In the rural areas, people would make their own alcohol, and this of course was the idea of moonshine, which they usually made at night, thus the moon was shining, because if they made it in the daytime it was easier to detect. I think we mentioned this the other day, but the people who moved the moonshine around and sold it often had very fast cars in order to run away from the police, and after Prohibition ends they will race those cars and it becomes today's NASCAR. So there was bathtub gin in the cities. They make their own alcohol, but the problem with Prohibition was the poor enforcement of it, mainly because many Americans actually didn't like the law. And ultimately it will be reversed in 1933 with the 20th Amendment, and it will be seen as a noble experiment, and the idea being that it was a good try to control something that probably Americans overdo, which is the use of alcohol, but it was just too difficult to cut out the